Thank you very much, Regina. Thank you, Oya, Ladislav, and everyone organizing this fantastic conference. I'm very happy to be here in person. A bit of an epic moment. It has taken me 30 hours to arrive from New Orleans after delays and layovers, and now I am expecting a hurricane that will land at the same time that my flight is expected to land. So I will let you know what happens. But being in person, it makes all the difference. Regina was saying, I'm a practicing dean with my firm Aldayjover, based in Barcelona. I actually define myself as a designer, someone who puts together and manages complexity and conflicts to develop a transformer scenario. Here you have some glimpses about our work in these different fields. I actually see, and this is a kind of a statement, I actually see disciplines same as nationalities. I would abolish all of them, but until that happens, I'm trying to collect as many as I can. So I'm in this mix of architecture, landscape architecture, and urbanism. And I'm also the dean at Tulane, as Regina was mentioning, which is a place that is in the New Orleans in the forefront of all the crises, environmental, of how long we will survive as a city, racial, economic, social, and it's a school that is removed from the East and the West Coast, and they're very self-referenced discourses that are often going on there. I used to talk more often about our work at Aldayjover, but also Oya has asked me this time to leave this aside and talk about education. And interestingly, and in the one topic of the three of this conference that I have not lectured before. So as I said, I'm a practitioner, dean, not a scholar, so please bear with me. The practice and education in architecture have increased in complexity in parallel to so many other areas of knowledge and professional practice in the contemporary world. Besides the digital revolution, as Pardy describes, humanity faces a combination of economic, political, and ecological crises that demand a profound change of how we are inhabiting the planet and the physical and non-physical structures that organize life in it. And we have finally discovered the limitation of the planetary resources, and we are beginning to bear the cost of the damages that we have produced since the industrial age. I will argue that the complexity of the built environment cannot be effectively addressed from any of its traditional disciplines alone. Architecture of objects does not usually go much more than serving the market by providing the product. The traditional urbanism of the master plan does not allow us to address the regional and metropolitan dimensions of the city of metabolisms at multiple scales. And engineering has perpetuated the logic of industrial specialization, designing monofunctional infrastructures that tend to solve one problem while generating several other additional problems. And you can see that in urban highways, river channels, or pumping systems. Any of these allied fields in themselves have multiplied their complexity and the depth required in each knowledge niche with specialties and subspecialties. So to the urgency and complexity of the planetary challenges, we should consider the differences in each region of the planet in matters of culture, climate, socioeconomics, professional competencies, or social perception. The unitary concept of the practice of architecture and the rest of the professionals of the built environment faces an infinite variety of essential or apparent banal circumstances, not the least the requirements for professional license. Is it still possible to speak of architecture, landscape architecture, urbanism, or the rest of the fields as professions with shared corpuses across regions and continents? 100 years after the emergence of the modern era, and with it, the regulatory definition of education, the architect, and the most of the allied professionals, architecture has undergone phases of flourishing and crisis. During them, the ambition, commitment, and sense of relevance have wavered and at times almost disappeared. Does it make sense to think about a possible common agenda for architecture and the built environment at this historical moment? And if so, what's the role of and transformative potential of the different professionals in the built environment, their specialties and the areas of overlap, something that we were discussing yesterday? So I will discuss these questions in three parts: our retrospective reflection, our contemporary condition, and the difference from 60 years ago, and some schematic proposals for the education of architects and allied professionals. In retrospect, the modern movement, which reached the apogee in the mid-20th century, contributed to developing an almost global consciousness about the role of and potential of architecture and urbanism. The architecture and urbanism of early 20th century avant-garde is not only an aesthetic and material alternative, but also a social political proposal. Architects embraced social housing as a leitmotif, and modern architecture is understood to be unescapable, committed to social transformation, including the recovery of the cities of a continent devastated by successive world wars. The revisions of the modern movement put into crisis the purity of the canons of the abstract homogeneity of rationalist architecture. However, those revisions were not enough to effectively correct the path of architectural thinking and practice to prevent the end of the 1960s explosion on the hands of American populist embracement of the market and the parallel revolutionary backlash, as discussed by Frampton and Benevolo. As example, most of the Team 10 members preferred to ignore the urban destruction in the name of speculation, and Archigram anticipated architecture as mass consumption product, entertaining part of pop culture, free of technical, social, or ecological concerns. The postmodern movement bore fruit in the crisis of the 70s and 80s, especially with the institutionalization of the neoliberalism in the mechanics of the production of the built environment. From the transformative ambition of the first half of the 20th century, architecture withdrew towards alternative positions, be it of service to capital or a passive resistance, intellectual or social. Besides the growing economic and demographic complexity, the acceptance of the market economy as a fact that shapes the urban phenomenon led architects to assume their inability to project the city. As Pierre Vittorio Aureli states, the more architects have celebrated the urban condition as ungovernable, the more they created a perfect alibi for themselves to retreat in their professional mandate, to pretend that their work consists of pragmatically answering the demands of their clients. In the same text, Aureli quotes the cynical assertion of Robert Venturi: the architect's ever diminishing power and his growing ineffectiveness in shaping the whole environment can perhaps be reversed, ironically, by narrowing his concerns and concentrating on his own work. And by the way, check the gender. The postmodern renunciation to the transformative aspiration of modern architecture takes shape in three basic trends. First, the uncritical service to the market fosters the growth of architectural corporations whose efficiency depends on increasing consumerism and eliminates superfluous concerns, the cultural and political missions of the recent tradition of modern architecture. Second, following Venturi's suggestion, the autonomy of the architectural object as a work of art in itself, often a work of visual arts, often a work of visual arts with its own language and codes, incomprehensive to the uninitiated, meant the renounce of architecture to respond to the complexity of the environment, urban, social, political, economic, or ecological. The cultural ambition of architecture, especially in the US, took refuge in the academic realm, protected by impenetrable and retroalimentary scholarly discourses. Finally, after the crisis of the late 60s, the ambition for social transformation was structured through activist movements based on grassroots initiatives. Activist architecture substitutes specialist knowledge for consensual design or direct service to the dispossessed citizen. In some ways, it constitutes the symmetrical response to serving the market, equally uncritical, trivializing the architect's intellectual and purposeful capacity, and also alien to the common good on a larger scale of social and environmental welfare. The loss of capacity of the public sector in favor of private commercial interest have reinforced mistrust towards government and generated a progressive loss of the concept of the commons. Ironically, it could be interpreted as the unintentional return of the suffering inflicted to the colonized territories. Today, the course of the loss of the sense of common good in post-colonial megalopolis has been reproduced in many of contemporary Western societies under the preponderance of the neoliberal market, the decrease of the executive capacity of public power, and the people's loss of trust in administrations. These three trends have developed with variations in the different regions of the planet. Anglo-Saxon corporate architecture has dominated the market for large and small works in the United States and in many commissions internationally, making now the city as a cosmetic branding exercise problem. Some media stars that emerged with powerful cultural proposals are now multinational corporations. However, new generations of architects, urban planners, landscape architects, and engineers continue to propose alternatives, designing transformative interventions and advance new solutions. Talking about the contemporary condition, 60 years after the revisions of the modern movement, the social crisis of the late 60s of the last century, and the fragmentation of Western architecture between activism, the autonomous object, and the critical submission to the market, architecture and related fields confront significantly different conditions. Among many others, it's worth to highlight 6 aspects that suggest the possibility of correcting the trajectory followed during the last decades and of rethinking again our values and aspirations. Complexity. Perhaps one of the characteristics that best defines the contemporary conditions is the increasing complexity of our ecological, socioeconomic, technological, and political challenges that affect our daily life and the construction of our physical space. If the complexity, although growing, is not new, it is new the emerging awareness of this complexity and the recognition of being in a planet where there's no backyard to dump the unwanted. No backyard, hoping that this infinite natural sink will make that disappear. We are also in a global scope, not only in the environmental and inequality challenges, also the idea of architecture and its references. Focused for centuries on the Western countries of the Northern Hemisphere, it has been expanding. Some of the most interesting phenomena are occurring outside the United States and Western Europe. Influences do not travel in one single direction, they cross paths. The resources of the designer are extended far beyond his or her cultural background or geographical origin. Creative freedom is subsequently increased without the imprisonment of a style, allowing to focus on the questions to be solved, and potentially also beyond the legitimation of personal expression. Urbanization is a process that in the planet that continues its uncharted consumption and expansion beyond the cliches that are wielded in circles of architecture to justify a position. This is a very diverse context, from very extreme densities to continuous urban areas of very low densities and many other variations. It's a reality that is shaping the planet, and it's our working context for architecture, urban planning, and the rest of the fields. And we have a critical role in shaping, reducing, or exacerbating social and environmental issues. But whatever the dimension and morphology of the various urban contexts across the globe, we are finally beginning to recognize their multi-scalar reality and their metabolic character. Although urban governance beyond the conventional idea of the city is not resolved, the physical reality is unequivocal. The metabolic flows of urban regions have the variety of scopes alien to the traditional limit of the city. The cycles of garbage, drinking water, wastewater, food, energy, commerce, of movement of workers need to be close or balanced at very different scales, many of them being the building, the public space, the neighborhood, or the landscape. And they open new possibilities for architecture and for the rest of the fields of the built environment, new themes, new scales, new typological explorations, etc. The disciplinary concept that we were discussing yesterday, it's in my point of view, is a concept that is to be criticized. as a finite, undefined field. It has proven obsolete and useless to deal with the complexity of the themes and the production of contemporary architecture itself. Buildings, public spaces, or infrastructures require a breadth and a depth of knowledge that the designer cannot face alone as an individual creator. In parallel, the limits between the building, the public space, the infrastructure, or the landscape dissolve from the very moment that we accept that the built environment responds to systems that are interrelated and have different scopes. Refocusing the activity on the issues to be addressed rather than the issues that a discipline know how to address immediately introduces fluidity in the disciplinary understanding and allows the overlaps between the various fields to be planned, intentionally planned. Just think about housing, which is the heart of our work. From typologies to the construction of the city to its social, cultural, economic, and environmental impact. Infrastructures have historically been and continue to be today the main tools in the transformation of the territory. They have been the focus of investment around the world, especially since the second quarter of the 20th century. Infrastructure is seen as the key to advancement in developing countries and the competitive leadership of rich countries. However, architecture and urban planning have traditionally been far removed from the design and integration of urban and territorial infrastructures. The capacity of architecture and our fields to synthesize complexity and to address in a holistic way the transformations derived from the insertion of infrastructures should serve to change the usual practice of responding to single logics, isolated from their context. A myriad of previous interventions have shaped territories and cities, often with very serious consequences. Urban nuclei cut off by highways, territories sinking or being flooded by heroic hydraulic operations, etc. They require the revision from the lenses of architecture, urban planning, landscape architecture, or from our new integrating conception of engineering. Those 6 aspects specific to the built environment, we must add other important transformations that have changed the contemporary compared to 5 decades ago. Probably the most obvious one is the digital age. But the magnitude of our contemporary challenges and the complexity of the built environment are often imposing for educators and professionals in our fields, especially in architecture. To Robert Venturi's argument for disciplinary reduction is often added the derogatory coda about the ridiculousness of aspiring to save the world. Attempting to address major societal concerns from architecture, urban planning, etc., is described by certain academic circles as a naive and futile effort that are far from what someone thinks as true architecture. And in parallel, the movements that consider the architect as social activist tend to focus on the resolution of urgent social issues, emancipated from the architectural project and underestimating the potential of architecture to affect reality of the urban condition. The formulation of architecture as activism tends to renounce the field's knowledge, deny the value of the project, and reduce the potential for action to a grassroots work limited in scale and impact. Both reductionist positions of the scope and focus on action led to the relevance of the fields of the built environment and the definition of urban models and the habitation of the territory. But a map of the world that does not include utopia, as Oscar Wilde wrote, is not even worth glancing at. To paraphrase Wilde, a professional and educational proposal that does not include the utopia is not worth considering. The caliber of today's challenges does not allow a nostalgic return to past attitudes and solutions, but it calls for a recovering and surpass the ambition that architecture and urban planning has shown at times. We can claim that architecture has historically been the most accurate and perdurable reflection of the culture of its time, but it's not enough. How would a renewed ambition regarding societal concerns be formulated today? At least from the educational fields of architecture and the allied fields. A very schematic proposal. Thinking in the object, in a tool, and in a path. To address the question of this roundtable regarding the universality of architectural education, it's necessary to start by questioning the disciplinarization of architecture and the rest of the fields, and to overcome the classic vision of a delimited area in which to acquire the list of competencies. Yesterday, there were claims for a core. After thousands of years of profession, is the difficulty of this inquiry not enough to prove its fiction? Shouldn't we feel comfortable acknowledging the diversity of ways of being architect or an allied professional? The scope, each scope of our fields is not clearly and statically defined, as expanded concepts proposed by gremial organizations are already proposing, like in this diagram. Overlaps are not only inevitable, but necessary, and they constitute the most productive areas for innovation. I propose to discard the image of disciplines as rigid geometries of concentric circles like fried eggs, fighting for territorial competencies, and to replace it with the idea of diffuse fields, variable geometries, and overlapping areas like clouds. These clouds are made by multiple geometries and overlapping areas of knowledge and application, sometimes shared between different fields, even with each professional shaping his or her own cloud. All the fields of the built environment overlap each other in a continuous and changing way depending on the specific temporal and geographical cultural circumstances. As example, who owns the public space and the street? No disciplinary response is satisfactory. But these obvious overlaps immediately suggest expanding relationships between the fields of the built environment towards ecology, biology, economics, art, communication, digital technologies, or social sciences. What is the implication of this expansion of the education of architecture and other associated fields? This first attempt proposed these objectives, tools, and ways of advancement. Objective, the inescapable objective of education of architecture and associated fields cannot be other than transforming the way we are inhabiting the planet. The individuality of the architects and the rest of the professionals, their creative capacity and their intellectual commitment become most meaningful when focusing on understanding the societal concerns and confronting the environmental and social challenge. Alignment between individual or team creativity and focus on societal needs is urgent, both for the planet and for the relevance of architecture and our fields after the postmodern submission to populist service to the neoliberal market. It is not true that architecture, urbanism, landscape architecture, etc., are incapable of responding to this gigantic challenge. Not true. The reformulation of the city as a multi-scale metabolic being is the urgent project to turn into a physical reality. The housing crisis caused by industrialization, an approach as a great project for modern architecture 100 years ago, pales in comparison with the lack of decent housing in megalopolis of developing country, but also in the backyards of European and American cities. The reformulation of public spaces as new biotopes has just only begun to be tested. The lack of infrastructure is overwhelming and they cannot be thought in a traditional way. Instead, each infrastructure needs to become hybrid that fulfills multiple functions, social, urban, and ecological. Formulating the ambition of architecture and the rest of our fields can be understood as the main agenda for professional schools. Beyond technical knowledge, the most important baggage for our new graduates is to start their professional career is their conviction and the security about the capacity of their tools to physically transform their territories. The tool, professional competencies vary in different places. Cultural, constructive, political, or legal traditions force the professional to navigate diverse circumstances, not to mention the diversity of the population to serve. Regardless of the scale, the budget, or the legal powers, the project is an instrument to plan a transformation from the Latin projectum, something thrown forward. And that something is intentionally launched with a direction and a scope to transform reality, is design. Everyone on Earth has a project, but very few have design. Design can be defined as the creative management of complexity. Define, synthesize, and overcomes conflicts. There's no design without conflict. Against the disquisition on disciplinary territories, designing shifts the focus from the object, the building, the landscape, or the infrastructure, to the action. transforming a reality, creatively managing its complexity. Problems to be solved as opposed to territories of practice and education. With this shift, the property limits of each professional territory loses relevance. The focus shifts from to synthesizing a complex response for the need of the place and the people. And something like a method. The challenges are unprecedented and they demand more from future professionals, more imagination, more commitment, and from the very base of the education, more innovation. Architecture is an essential human need and a profession formulated 2 millennia ago. Perhaps this essentiality implies an inertia, something that was told yesterday as well, that has kept architecture behind many other fields in terms of the evolution of its cultural and social habits, and also in terms of its space of innovation. Architectural innovation has often been linked to technical advances, which also provide new glasses for looking problems differently, going from quantitative to a qualitative change. The current digital revolution has placed us in a moment of disruption with potentials still to be seen. However, advancing in architecture beyond Brunelleschi's dome or the Paxton scale-up greenhouse occur in minimal increments. The development and testing of new scenarios through the project is based on a deep cultural and technical corpus to which new questions and potential answers are added. Unlike science, the project can hardly propose new theories to be tested. But design research has legitimacy in itself, the creation of new scenarios, typological, programmatic, material, or hybrid. Also, unlike science, design research faces difficulties for formulating guiding standards and evaluation parameters. Architecture often falls prey of self-indulgence, of creative individuality, or commercial seduction. Self-induction based on suggestive discourses with promises rarely verified after the fact. The rigorous examination of the result is an essential condition to accelerate the pace of innovation in architecture and all the fields of the built environment, alien to what has been the traditional evolution of the discipline. How we embed in architectural and related fields in the education and practice a specific, deliberate, and measurable component of innovation at each step, in each project, compatible with holistic resolution of the complexity of each problem. How this deliberate and incremental contribution is formulated and then assessed and evaluated. It's possible to embed the formulation of a hypothesis and the development of the corresponding thesis as a regular practice for every project. As conclusion, architecture solves problems, starting with providing shelter, but the new challenges have grown in scale and are the product of previous practices. The universality of education and practice in our fields rely today in the shared objectives. The impact in an urgent planetary transformation, in the tools, design, focus to solve issues without artificial boundaries, and in methods, a continuous and accountable innovation mindset. Thank you very much.